Before we jump into the video, I want to take the time to encourage everybody who may be interested in participating in this conversation to take the time to watch the video in its full context. I know that these conversations may seem one way or lopsided in the other way, but the best thing you can do is just listen to the broader conversation and then eventually make up your mind. I try my best to provide as much data, maybe some evidence or some scenarios as I can in order for you to be able to get a context of where I'm coming from. So feel free to engage in the conversation in the comment section after you've been able to gather the full entirety of the video. Thanks for watching. So, what does it take for a game to run at 60 FPS? Now, most of us who are probably in this conversation don't know, but developers, for the most part, they have to deal with the day-to-day runnings and development of a game, so they actually do know, and optimization and the way you plan and build your game are going to be the main and most important things. This is according to the technical developers over at Epic Games, the guys that make Unreal Engine 4. They've been kind enough to do a lot of conferences and do a lot of talks around optimization and how your game can actually run at the frame rates that you want it to run, and making sure that that's something you prioritize. Now, the conversation about 60 FPS came up with Gotham Knights, and now we're seeing Zelda, a game that plays at 30 FPS, admittedly on much more weaker hardware, also get the price tag of $70. I've already said that 30 FPS games are fine, but it appears that in the gaming scene, some people will castigate one game at 30 FPS and accept another game at 30 FPS. In fact, just recently, I also showed you guys an article where a specific games journalist talked about how they could not go to Redfall because it's 30 FPS, and that no amount of art form or visual fidelity would make them go to a 30 FPS game, but then on the other hand, wrote how they were excited about Zelda. Now, this is a very interesting conversation because I'm glad people now are ready to have me talk about the hardware. I've seen a lot of people say, well, you seem to be conflating issues. Zelda on a Nintendo Switch is fine at 30 FPS because that is the capability of the handheld console. It can only do that game at 30 FPS. So make sure you mention the hardware. And I agree. I remember months ago I was making this case with Gotham Knights that the hardware, the PS5 and the Series X, could only support Gotham Knights at 30 FPS, but I was told that I was crazy, and because the console could do 60 FPS, Gotham Knights should be able to do 60 FPS. Ladies and gentlemen, this particular standard is actually throwaway because if we applied it anywhere else, we'll realize that it's actually not realistic because every video game is designed differently. To make your video game run at 60 FPS on a weaker console, you really have to make some changes that may not necessarily be the best. Because as you can see, or if you've actually been paying attention, Gotham Knights does run at 60 FPS on much more higher performing machines like some of the PCs out there. And I say some because I also have some gaming PCs that do not run Gotham Knights at 60 FPS. And these PCs are more powerful than an Xbox Series X and a PS5. Now, I know that might surprise people who are just coming into the new generation of console, but this is something where on the PC side, we've understood this for a very long time. Depending on how capable your machine is, you can actually play certain video games at high frame rates, and you have to sometimes sacrifice and play some at low frame rates because your machine has to obey the limitations of your hardware. On the PS5 and the Series X, they also have limitations that they have to abide by. But here's where I think the confusion is. A lot of people are going by the marketing that the people who made the PS5 and the Series X kind of dished out to them, and they're not paying very close attention to the reality that games come out, and many times they'll push a machine to the point where that machine cannot attain the 60 FPS mode, but other machines can. And so developers will say, in many cases, you take the 30 FPS and then anybody else who's got a more powerful machine can get the 60 FPS. But if we were to make a 60 FPS version for this same game for a much less powerful machine, what we're going to get is something that looks like this, which is actually Mortal Kombat 11 that runs on 60 FPS on the Nintendo Switch. Compared to, say, Mortal Kombat 11 that runs on the Xbox Series X, you'll notice that picking the same characters, and even for a 2D game, that is actually, in my opinion, something that probably should not require too much in terms of processing capacity, you will realize that sacrifices have already been made for this Mortal Kombat 11 version on the Switch compared to any other version. including the PlayStation 4 version, which is also running 60 FPS, because many people swore that they had never seen 60 FPS until they bought the PS5, when the PlayStation 4 and even its predecessor had been doing 60 FPS on other games. You see, this whole 60 FPS conversation makes it sound like, oh, not until the PS5 did we get this new shiny thing, and hence everything must now become that way, when that's not really been the case. So we'll look at this Mortal Kombat example here. You'll notice that the character models still remain intact, but a lot of the textures and the quality of your environmental density is greatly reduced. This is so that the game can actually perform, because you do need 60 FPS for fighting games. A lot of fast action combat games require this, but in the case of fighting games, because of the way frame data works and being able to execute a lot of your commands, you do require that the game will perform or be locked at a specific frame rate. Looking at the way these two games kind of differ in the way that their quality is, you can already tell that yes, they had to make concessions to accommodate this specific machine. Now, in the case of the PlayStation 5 compared to PC, not every game is going to run at parity for both machines. I mean, even some PCs that are more powerful than the PS5 will struggle to hit Gotham Knights at 60 FPS. I also have a few examples that we can examine here in this video, because I really want to make sure that we're not setting some expectations that are unrealistic. So for my testing, I used 3 different builds. Build number 1 is a gaming laptop that has an RTX 2060 and a 6-core Intel processor. Build number 2 is another Intel laptop that has an RTX 2070 and a much more newer Intel 6-core processor than the 2060 laptop. These 2 computers run Gotham Knights actually fairly well. The challenge, though, among both of them when you look at the metrics is the 2060 laptop fails to hit Gotham Knights anywhere past about 50 FPS. Even when you lower all of the different aspects like the volume of the density and some other different settings and move it all the way to the lowest setting, you still cannot achieve 60 FPS. Now, by and large, we could argue that this particular laptop that can run other games like God of War and even Spider-Man at 60 FPS is struggling to actually hit Gotham Knights at this point. You can point out optimization and all kinds of other things, but we also notice that if you just move a little bit upwards to a slightly better machine, you can actually run Gotham Knights at 60 FPS on the RTX 2070 laptop. Now, granted, this laptop, I specifically bought it to learn game development on the go, because it is one that actually has the capability of running Unreal Engine. It has a better graphics card, has a slightly better CPU. And so I thought it was probably going to get the job done, because the other 2061 would get into some hiccups whenever you were running Unreal Engine and dealing with some shader compilation. So these machines do have their limitations for some games, while for some other games, they actually do excel. In fact, we even see it on the Xbox Series X and the PS5, where a game like Callisto Protocol at launch was having some issues on the Xbox version, but the PlayStation version was actually running much better, because both machines, even though they may be on parity, they're not exactly the same one-to-one. You also have machines like the Series S and the Series X. The Series S is actually a newer device than the PS4, but it is, in my opinion, supposedly to perform more than the PS4. But when you look at the Series S, some games cannot run on the Series S at 60 FPS, even though the Series S can do 60 FPS for many games. Example of one of those is Evil West, while the Series X can run that game at 60 FPS in 1080. But the Series S can actually get a little bit more in terms of resolution, but with frame rates, they had to lock it at 30. And I think the reason why is because at some point, that Series S starts to hit some instability issues, just like my RTX 2060 laptop was hitting some instability issues, including other factors that you have to look into, like the way heat dissipation and throttling is done with your Xbox. This is a lot of stuff that I don't really know, but on PCs, you can tell. When you're using these laptops, the fan speed kicks up whenever you start to hit some high performing areas. This is to help you regulate temperature and continue to keep your performance as high as possible. If the heat reaches a significant threshold where it gets too hot, it will throttle performance down, basically starting to use less resources so that you can continue to play the game, but you'll notice frame drops if you don't have a good cooling solution, of which with these laptops, their cooling solutions are limited just like your consoles. So this is where I think consoles usually face struggles in regard to how they actually deal with video games. On the PC side, though, we've learned that we can just build a gaming PC and we can upgrade components as time goes on. I also did some other comparisons just to make sure that we're not going crazy by looking at the PC version of Gotham Knights and using a GTX 1080 Ti. Yes, you heard me, a GTX 1080 Ti. I usually hear a lot of people say that the PS5 and the Series X are actually comparable to maybe say GPUs like the 2070. Now, regarding ray tracing, I would say that's possibly a case that you can make, but a 1080 Ti in terms of say raw rasterization power, there's no way a PlayStation 5 could ever dream of coming close to this 2016 monster. And I'm fortunate to still have one, so I decided, you know what? Let's go ahead and run Gotham Knights on this particular device. So I slapped it into my computer, which has a Ryzen 9 5950X CPU, which at this point you could say, okay, the GPU is bottlenecking the CPU, yes, but let's just say the CPU is giving the GPU all the juice it needs, and we just go with that particular notion. I realized that this 1080 Ti could actually run Gotham Knights at 1440 at 60 FPS with a varied amount of different settings here and there. And then if you even go all the way up to 4K, you'll realize that the 1080 Ti is actually now limited at the 4K level. It is only able to actually run the game somewhere around 4K 30 something FPS with some settings here and there, which is its limitation. Yes, it's capable of 4K, but it is 4K with some limitations that's actually attached to it. And I thought this was actually very interesting. So I started to play around with a whole bunch of different settings, and I was able to figure out that, okay, this GPU is still a beast and a monster, because when it was mostly made for 1080p gaming and a little bit of 1440p, because at that time, there wasn't too much of the ubiquity of 1440 screens and even 4K screens for gaming at that moment. So the 1080 Ti is still a beast until this day and age. I then went back and looked at the Gotham Knights version on the Xbox to kind of compare in terms of texture quality, in terms of field view quality and asset quality and so on and so forth. And I realized that on the surface, the Xbox version of the Gotham Knights game looks actually quite better when you lock it at 4K 30 FPS compared to that 1080 Ti at 4K 30 FPS. The texture quality and the material quality and the lighting just seem to be quite good. In fact, I even tried to balance the brightness of both of them. And I realized that the Xbox version, according to what the developers had said, which is that their game provides you a much more detailed version of the game at 30 FPS, they decided that they were not going to have a performance mode because this is the best place to have kept the game. So I did what everybody had said. Everybody had been saying, well, why don't they just lower the resolution and give the game to us in 60 FPS? And then I did that. And I realized that the game actually looks ugly at 1080p, 60 FPS. And I was shocked because I was like, this is interesting, because you would swear that if you just reduce the resolution, you're going to get a better playing game. But the problem is you're not going to get a better presented game so far based on how they designed their game. I don't know all the intricacies as to their textures, as to the LODs that they decided to use. There's just so many things in their own decision making that I can't seem to fathom. And I can now understand even better why they decided that they were going to lock the game to 30 FPS. Now, before we continue, I wanted to add a post-production note surrounding the Switch version and the regular version of Mortal Kombat 11. Because one could say, okay, could it not be that the developers could have modified Gotham Knights in a way where it could run at 60 FPS on the console? I think that's a good argument to make. There's nothing wrong with that. But we could also make the same argument for the Zelda game, because we have Diablo, we have Mortal Kombat also running at 60 FPS on the Switch. Could there not have been a way for the developers to also go ahead and do it? Now, I know I'm comparing these things so that I can point out that whenever you hold one game to a standard, you actually will want to try to be consistent. You want to hold other games to a standard. Now, I understand that this might sound like a gotcha, but if we even look at, say, possible solutions, you might want to look at another Warner Brothers studio who got the opportunity to be able to do something like this. Imagine, say, you were at Avalanche, the guys who made Hogwarts Legacy. If you notice, they released the version for the next-gen consoles first, or current-gen consoles. They released it on PC, and then they delayed the release of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions. Then they even further delayed the release of the Switch. This should tell you that these versions of the game are significantly different, because you could argue that maybe they could have just made the same version that they made available for the Xbox Series X and PS5, lock that to 30 FPS and throw it on a PS4, and then throw that one on the Xbox One. But it doesn't really always work like that. I know I did some comparisons here with the 1080 Ti and so on and so forth, But like the developers said in their own explanation as to why they don't have a performance win for Gotham Knights, they basically understood that it's not just as simple as tweaking resolutions and so on and so forth. You really have to go in and develop the game based on all kinds of different fun stuff. So that PlayStation 4 version is going to have some tweaks that are actually put in it. Say maybe lighting modifications, all kinds of asset modifications to make the game still look good and look on parity. But for the most part, a lot of things will be made much different than the regular versions that we already have available. And then when we move into the Switch version, that one is also going to get a lot of modifications that are also done to it in order to make it play. In the case of Gotham Knights, the developers, their window and their schedule included post-release content specific to the game and possibly them already working on their other game. So it's one of those things where both studios, yes, they're under Warner Brothers, but they both seem to have their own goals and benchmarks that their own bosses were probably setting for them. So if you were in their position, you probably have, in my mind, what I think is just a simple option to make, move on, get your next game going, cancel your PlayStation 4 version, because even with your online aspect that you're going to be adding to the game, the PlayStation 4 might still have a problem even running the game. I mean, the Hogwarts Legacy game is a single player game. It doesn't have a multiplayer aspect to it. It doesn't have a co-op aspect to it. So it's not even the same kind of game as Gotham Knights, which it's seamless multiplayer. And then you being able to ride your bicycle and explore anywhere in the world with somebody else, which is wild that they're not even using servers in the same capacity as like Division 2. Let me explain. And I know this is supposed to be a post-production edit, but we got to talk about this. A game like Tom Clancy's The Division 2, it uses its servers in Ubisoft's own, server farms to run things like your AI, a lot of different stuff for the Division and the Division 2 game. This is why the Division and the Division 2 are fully online games. Your player runs on your console, but you have to connect to the internet, basically their servers, to be able to run the remaining parts of the game. Gotham Knights did not use that option. They gave you your full game, but the sacrifice was, in order to run the co-op and the multiplayer aspects within the same game environment, you have to use limited server capabilities. For them to have been able to maybe make that separate, they'll have to make the game like Red Dead Redemption 2, where you have your Red Dead Redemption game, which you play, and then you go to Red Dead Online, which you can then connect to a whole different server, and everybody does all kinds of stuff online. You have your player character there, and so on and so forth. I hope this makes sense. So we can actually agree and admit that your new consoles are actually better, for the most part, in some games than that particular setup with that GPU and maybe even the processors, the quad cores, and so on and so forth that people used to pair up with them from back in the day. So machine change and hardware development is something that continues to evolve. Software development, on the other hand, also evolves, but when they're depending on one another, they'll behave very differently with different interactions. So I don't necessarily see where we can say that Zelda gets a pass to run at 30 FPS because it's a handheld and is therefore an inferior console, but the PlayStation 5 and the Series X, which I know are inferior consoles based on my testing, based on testing that has also been done by places like Gamers Nexus and around the internet, and then somehow we just think because Microsoft said so, then it must be it. Even the internet does not even believe that Microsoft's marketing of the most powerful console is actually valid, because they mock it all the time whenever these games don't perform well on them, because the consoles are just limited. Do you really think that Microsoft actually blew $1,000 to develop a console to sell it to you at 50% the lost price? I doubt it. They were able to squeeze out as much hardware at the cost that they possibly could. Maybe they lost a little bit of money in each hardware sale, which I kind of doubt they did, but whatever. But let's just say they actually are losing an extra $100 or $50 per console. There's no way that extra $100 or $50 is going to basically shoot you from where that machine is to being able to run everything at 60 FPS. A machine that can run everything at 60 FPS is significantly much more expensive than a $500 device anywhere, any day. Unless somebody gave you that device for $500, having paid $900 to $1,000 for it, and then said, hey, there you go. But I doubt that Sony and Microsoft did that, especially with the number of consoles into the tens of millions. You're talking significant millions of dollars of losses. These companies ain't taking that for us, man. But here's my presentation. Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section. Hopefully we'll talk pretty soon in another one. Peace out.